Sir Richard Dalton, thank you very much for giving your time to Kayhan London online for this Skype interview.
Thank you for inviting me.
Sir Richard, the latest headline out of Vienna is that Iran has accused major powers on Friday of backtracking on previous pledges, throwing up new red lines at nuclear talks after the deadline to reach an agreement in time to receive expedited scrutiny from the U.S. Congress expired with no deal. What do you think is holding up the agreement, sir?
It's not clear, and both sides are being careful not to negotiate in public. But I think there are three big questions outstanding, and they are linked in the sense that to achieve a compromise, there has to be give and take on all three. The first issue is whether or not the arms embargo, which has formed part of the sanctions designed to bring Iran to the negotiating table, is going to be lifted as part of the initial response of the UN Security Council to the agreement and subsequent implementation of the deal, or whether it's going to be kept longer in force, thus inhibiting the strengthening of Iran's armed forces and, above all, inhibiting the delivery to Iran of air defense missiles, which has been a frozen contract from Russia for some time now. The second issue is about the phasing of sanctions relief generally. In other words, at what point exactly do the financial, the banking, the oil sanctions go in relation to the specified stages of implementation of the agreement by Iran? And the third issue still seems to be the question of Iran's research and development in the later stages of implementation of the agreement, 8, 9, 10 years' time, into the more efficient forms of centrifuge separation of the different elements of enriched uranium. The 5+1 want to postpone that because it would potentially, if Iran should decide to cheat, speed up the process of accumulating sufficient enriched uranium for a bomb. Iran wants to bring forward the date because it wishes, at the expiry of the period of the agreement, to be able to generate significant quantities of fuel for civil nuclear power reactors from domestic resources. So it's not clear to me how that big impasse is going to be cleared.
Yeah. Mr. Zarif is saying that the major powers are now throwing up excessive demands on Iran, new red lines. Do you have any idea what those red lines might be?
Well, it comes down to interpretation of the agreements reached in early April at Lausanne, and the degree of commitment of both sides to the language which the United States publicized. It went much further, as you know, in its summary of what had been agreed than the actual formal document announced at a press conference by the EU and Foreign Minister Zarif. The Americans are saying they will walk away from the negotiations if any aspect of their understanding of what was agreed in Lausanne is not now agreed to by Iran. And it could be that Foreign Minister Zarif is trying to maintain that aspects of the American document weren't actually part of the formal agreement at Lausanne. But that's speculation on my part. So it's impossible for outsiders to say just what it is that Iran finds as excessive new demands and new red lines.
Sir Richard, one of the things that Western powers are complaining is that Iran is changing its word. Like in Lausanne, they had an agreement on visiting every suspect site anywhere in the country, and Iran signed off to it. Then after it was all said and done, Iran came out and said, no, we are not going to allow visit of the military sites. So the problem is that Iran is backtracking. First they say something, then they change their word when they feel some pressure from inside, from the hardliners inside the country.
It's not clear to me that that is the case. I mean, you may be right. Iran has agreed to the internationally accepted principle of managed access under the additional protocol to military sites. But the small print, the fine detail of how such managed access is to take place is what the argument is about. So how can Iran be persuaded that there is legitimate reason to visit a particular site? How will the visit of the inspectors to that site be conducted? What will they visit? And how will parts of that site which have no relation to the allegation of the presence of nuclear material in that site be protected from the visits of inspectors? These issues are part of the stock in trade of inspectors visiting, say, British or American facilities in accordance with treaty arrangements, but they are complex. And settling the details and ensuring that Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei can agree and that these details can be justified to the Iranian Majlis, all of whom have taken a strong position against visits to military sites. That is a difficult political problem for Foreign Minister Zarif and President Rouhani.
What do you think IRGC's position is on this?
I am assuming that they are backing the position of the Supreme Leader and some elements in the Majlis. And of course, in the back of everyone's mind is the assassination of certain Iranian scientists. But we have to remember too that Iran has given access to military sites in the past, and managed access, as it is called, under the additional protocol is an established part of the additional protocol, which Iran has consistently said since the beginning of this negotiation that it is willing to implement and in due course to ratify. So I don't see this as an insuperable problem. And I do think the negotiators should give themselves sufficient time, not only to work through the details, but also to find the trade-offs in other areas that are still to be agreed in order to assure themselves that both sides come out feeling that they have won. This is an agreement they can implement wholeheartedly and live with.
Yes. Sir Richard, one of the things that is mentioned now is that windfall that Iran will get out of this deal, about $100 billion of windfall money that will go to Iran. The fear of the Persian Gulf Arab countries is that Iran might use this new money, new injection of money into its economy for furthering its aims in other countries in the region, namely Iraq, Syria, Yemen, or Bahrain. However, White House is hoping that Iran behavior will be somehow modified after receiving all this huge money and using that for its economy, for making the lots of people better. What do you think Iran might do with this windfall, and which side has a better argument, White House or the Gulf countries in the region?
Undoubtedly the White House. After all, the Gulf countries are in the course of purchasing billions and billions of dollars of weapons from the United States and other countries. They are enormously ahead of Iran in their conventional military capabilities. They have built up a very significant deterrent capability, and they are not in a strong position to complain about Iran receiving money, which is Iran's, which is the Iranian people's money. But to look at how the money might be spent, we have to remember that Iran's budget is currently going through a period of contraction because of the fall in the price of oil. It is far harder for Iran to absorb that fall in the price of oil than its Gulf neighbors, partly because of the Gulf neighbors' massive external reserves and financial balances, which enables them to operate their budgets at a deficit. In the case of Iran, not only have they shortage of funds for routine expenditure, but nearly all capital expenditure has had to be suspended. There are the country is littered with half-completed or unfinished capital projects, and that accounts for the contraction of the Iranian economy in previous years. Although there was a spurt of growth last year, perhaps up to 2 or 3%, this year Iran's growth is going to be 1% or worse. So I believe that the overwhelming majority of the funds to be released will be spent domestically. The banks in Iran have weak balance sheets. The government owes money across the economy and owes money to banks. There is structural change and structural reform and strengthening of the Iran's public finances to be undertaken before they can hope to boost economic growth back to the trend of 5 or 6%, which they have achieved in the late 20th century and the first 10 years of the 21st century. So yes, there will be additional funds for Iran's armed forces. There's no doubt about that. But I don't believe that additional funding is going to substantially change the balance of forces or substantially change Iran's behavior across its borders.
Richard, as the talks are continuing, U.S. is also testing a weapon, a bunker busting a bomb, a huge bomb. I think it's like 15 tons, and they are still, having that military option in the back of their minds. The military planners in the U.S. Do you think that it might ever come to that stage, even though these talks are going on? Do you think that at one point in the future, maybe, even if this agreement is signed, there might come a time that U.S. and other countries might feel that Iran is cheating, and that military option will become the
I think
first
it
and
is
foremost?
overwhelmingly in the national interest of Iran and of the international community for this agreement to be concluded. And I believe there will be strong incentives on all parties, including Iran, to adhere to it. The phrase that we have heard so much of over the years, that the military option is still on the table, will be heard after the conclusion of a deal. In other words, military deterrence will play a part in America's policy towards the region, towards protecting its interests, towards protecting the interests of its strategic partners on the Arabian side of the Persian Gulf. But the consequences of a war would be disastrous. Not only would it destroy any chance of the Iranian determination not to develop nuclear weapons to be preserved, but it would have massive unintended consequences in the extension of violence widely across the Middle East region. So I don't believe that any country will use the military option lightly. I think if the agreement is concluded, the deterrent posture will be maintained, but the chances of a war recede strongly. If, on the other hand, the negotiations break down irretrievably, and I think that's very unlikely, then Iran is likely to want to develop its civil nuclear enrichment capability in order to provide fuel for reactors power stations in due course, and that will be regarded as highly provocative by the United States and its allies. So the chances of war will rise. But again, war is not inevitable even under those circumstances.
And so the last question is that what is your prediction? Last time you said when the Geneva talks were going on in 2013, you said 60 to 40% for the agreement. Mr. Obama is saying it's less than 50-50 this time. What is your prediction, sir?
I'm not sure Obama would say that it's only 50-50 now. I expect he's more optimistic. I certainly am. I think they are very close, and I don't think what divides them is enough to make both sides reject the progress they have already made and go back to square one. So even if this effort in July 2015 fails, I would expect there to be an agreement by the end of the year.
Thank you so very much, Sir Richard Dalton.